The hillside didn't look like much, not to men who'd built with their hands in the flat, open lands where a man could see what was coming and shoot it dead if he needed. That hill rose sharp from the valley floor like a woman's stubborn chin, and the woman who'd dug herself into its side had one of those too. Her name was Claraara, and the first time the men saw what she was doing, they laughed like she'd just told the best joke west of Abilene. "Foolish," they said. "Ain't no use putting a cabin half buried in a slope. You want your roof to slide off in rain and your floor to drown in meltwater?" They shook their heads, spat in the dirt, and went back to raising tall, proud square cabins out on the open snow-blasted plains. Clara didn't argue. She just kept digging. The earth was dark and wet beneath her pick, hard-packed with stone, knotted with roots, the kind of earth you could hide in, the kind you could vanish into. She had the shoulders for the work, narrow but firm, and a quiet resolve that didn't need to announce itself. By the time the first frost kissed the tops of the trees that October, her hillside was halfway swallowed into itself, and the men were still hammering boards for their attics and porches and false fronts, each structure taller than the last, as if height alone could prove wisdom. Clara's cabin looked more like a scar. It had no porch, no visible chimney, just a low, sloping roof, its shingles hand-hewn and overlapped tight, buried to the edge in sod and weighted by stone. The front door was crooked and heavy, the kind that wouldn't rattle in a gale, and the one window she allowed herself was glass she'd traded for, triple thick and half the size of a man's hand. When folks asked why she'd built like that, if they bothered to ask, she said one thing: "Storms don't fight fair, so I don't build fair." They chuckled. She let them. But the real story started before the storm, before even the laughter. It started with the child. She wasn't Claraara when she first stepped off the back of that supply wagon. She had no last name then, not one she claimed. The child in her belly was no man's, or so she told those who dared ask, and she answered questions with silence like a sheriff answering with a gun. She came into the frontier town of Mero's End, with one crate, one pot, and one dead look in her eyes. Nobody knew where she came from, but the rumors didn't stay quiet for long. Some said she'd run from Kansas, where her husband had been shot in a card game. Others whispered she was an Eastern preacher's daughter who'd lost her mind and come west to find it. A few swore she'd been left pregnant by a trapper, or worse, by a railroad boss passing through. But Clara didn't feed any of those stories. She just bought a pickaxe, a saw, a crate of salvaged nails, and took the mule no one else wanted, a dull-eyed thing named Whisper with a gimp leg and a back too short for hauling. Together, they set out toward the hills where nobody else had claimed land. That alone told the men she was a fool. The hill she chose was barren and gray, stripped of tall trees by lightning years back. Its slope was mean and narrow, and a wind curled around it like a dog looking for a bite. But Clara studied it. She spent 3 nights just walking it, pressing her hands to the dirt, to the stone, to the slope's shadowed side where the snow clung longest. Then she dug. She didn't build on the hill. She built into it. She carved a trench deep enough to swallow a wagon, then deeper still. The men watched from the ridges, sometimes shouting down offers of help. "You want real walls? We got lumber." But more often just watching, their eyes gleaming with pity or scorn. Only one man climbed down to her spot, an old trader named Vaughan Tiller, who carried cloth, needles, and salt from ranch to ranch. "You building a grave, miss?" Clara wiped sweat from her brow, leaned on her pick. "No, sir. I'm building a door the cold can't find." Vaughan tilted his head. "Ain't seen a woman build like this before. Then I must be the first." She offered no smile. Vaughan left a tin of coffee in her crate that night, never asked for thanks. The weeks passed, then months, and winter crept down from the mountains like a sickness. The men's cabins stood proud, wide roofs, wide doors, and smoke curling up through chimney stacks like signal flags. They laughed and drank, and the air smelled of pork fat and cedar. But each morning, the frost came heavier, and each night the wind grew bolder. By mid-November, Clara's cabin vanished to the eye. Snow gathered on its roof so thick you'd think it had collapsed. Only the door remained visible, stone-framed, slanted low, and sealed by a wool blanket hung inside against the seams. Inside it was quiet. The walls were dirt-packed and fire-smoothed. She lined them with cloth, then with second-hand tar paper, then with hay and sacking stitched into long panels. The floor stayed dry because it wasn't flat. It sloped gently inward to a sunken center, lined with rock, where her stove sat like a warm heart. That stove, That was her secret. It wasn't made for cabins. It was meant for train cars, salvaged from a wreck 2 valleys over. With a wide belly and narrow vent, she'd rebuilt it herself with new pipes and a sealed base that sucked air not from the room, but from a pipe leading outside, which meant no drafts, no loss of heat. Her child came in the second week of December, under a full moon, and a sky so black it looked burnt. No midwife, just Clara, alone, blood on her thighs, jaw clenched, biting down on a strip of leather while the wind howled overhead like the dead come to claim her. She didn't scream. The baby was a girl, pale and small and quiet, but alive. Clara named her Wren. She swaddled the child in every soft scrap she owned and laid her near the stove, where the earth heat and coal heat mixed and rose. Outside, the wind shrieked like nails down bark. In town, the men's chimneys howled, roofs creaked, and then the storm came. Not a snowstorm, not wind, something older. A wave that rolled in from the north like the mountains had opened and spilled their fury. The snow didn't fall, it slammed, not in flakes, but in sheets. In fists of white so thick men couldn't see their hands in front of them. Winds tore shutters from cabins, split beams, ripped doors clean off. It wasn't just a storm, it was a test, and Clara Dawn's hillside cabin didn't shake, not once. She heard the wind clawing, but it had nothing to grip. She felt the temperature drop, but her earthen walls bled no heat. She saw the snow pile against her window, sealing them in, but she smiled when it did. Outside, the town's lanterns died, chimneys collapsed, fires went out. Men buried in their pride were about to find out what foolishness really was. The cold had a way of hollowing things out. It carved into men's cheeks, split the boards of cabins like peeling bark, and worked its way into bones with the same patience Clara had used when building her hillside refuge. By the second night of the storm, Mero's End wasn't a town anymore. It was a row of buried roofs, chimneys shattered, doors blown off hinges and buried in snowdrifts 6 feet high. And inside those cabins, if they could still be called that, families huddled in dwindling heat, breath visible in the dark, candles flickering low. Some had gone to bed early, hoping to sleep through the worst. Some never woke up. Others tried to flee. It was Ephraim Cole who made the first mistake. Big man, rancher, had the tallest house in the valley, with a wraparound porch and a glass-paned door. He ordered special from Denver. People used to say Ephraim's place was the crown of Mero's End. Now, as the storm howled like a demon in the rafters, and the cold punched through every crack like a siege, Ephraim found himself dragging his wife and daughter down the stairs, wrapped in coats and quilts and whatever else he could grab. They made it 20 paces before the wind knocked them flat. The girl, Rosie, just 7, was blown out of Ephraim's arms like a paper scrap and disappeared into the white. His wife screamed, turned, and ran into the blind dark. He chased them both. He never saw the lantern post he struck head first, just the flash, then blackness. They found all 3 come spring, Rosie frozen in a crouch under a cart, her mother curled over her like a cloak, and Ephraim flat beside the post with blood iced into his beard. They weren't the only ones. The Carpenter boys, Tom and Eli, tried to make it to their cousin's cabin across the frozen creek. They tied themselves together with rope, like fishermen in a storm, but snow filled their mouths, and they missed the bank. They drowned under powder, still tied together when they were dug out in April. Inside Clara's cabin, the silence was terrifying. Not because it was empty, but because it was complete. The storm made no sound beyond the walls. Wren didn't cry. The heat stayed constant. The walls didn't moan. Clara lay beside her daughter, one hand resting lightly on the tiny chest beneath the blankets, and stared up at the sod-covered ceiling. She did not pray. She did not sleep. She just watched the flicker of the stove light, slow and steady like a heartbeat on the walls, and waited. By the 4th day, the food stores in town were freezing solid inside the cabinets. Men chopped apart chairs and tables for wood. Families tore down stair railings, shelves, and finally doors. Anything that could burn. Still, the cold was faster. It filled lungs. It cracked skin. The very air became heavy and sharp. A few men made it to the saloon, where the walls were thick and the whiskey free. A barrel fire burned behind the counter, but even that could not warm the room. When the barkeep, Josiah, passed around a jug of turpentine to mix with the drink, 5 men accepted. 2 went blind before morning. 1 died. One old woman, Mags Harper, survived that week only because her house caught fire. The chimney cracked and a beam fell into her stove, setting the back wall ablaze. Mags dragged herself into the barn with 3 blankets and a goat. She lay there, shaking and burned, but alive. The heat from the flames gave her the only warmth she'd felt in days. The rest, the ones who mocked Clara's cabin, they died proud and cold. When the sky finally cleared, On the seventh day, the snow didn't stop falling. It just settled, flattened into a heavy white silence. Nothing moved. Not a single crow flew overhead. Not a single breeze stirred. The sun broke through like an accusation, cold, pale, and too late. Clara waited until noon. Then she opened the door. It took effort. The snow was packed tight against it. She had to shoulder it open, inch by inch, until the light streamed in and hit the straw-covered floor like gold on iron. She stepped out, Wren wrapped to her chest in a sling, her face half covered with a scarf stitched from scraps. The hill had vanished. Only the upper slope remained. The cabin completely buried except for the door she'd dug out and the chimney pipe hidden beneath a flat rock above. Every other house in the valley was blanketed, their peaks like tombstones in a snow graveyard. She didn't rush. She walked. The air was sharp, the light blinding. She headed first toward Vaughn Tiller's shack. Vaughn was alive, barely. His roof had caved, but the man had burrowed into his root cellar with his mule and 2 jugs of sour mash. Clara found him by the smoke, a weak curl from a vent he'd made with a hollow fence post. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. When she handed him a brick of hard biscuit from her coat, he cried, then drank. "I thought you was crazy," he said, coughing. "Digging like a badger?" Clara looked out toward the town. "Maybe I am," Vaughn grunted. "You ain't the only one left." She didn't answer. By the time Clara reached the edge of Mero's End, the snow had begun to shift. It settled like breath after panic, revealing shapes beneath it, some smooth, some broken. She moved past the blacksmith shop. The forge was a block of ice. Next, the cooper's. Its walls had folded inward like an empty box. Her boots crunched on something frozen and pale. She didn't look down. At the saloon, she found only Mags Harper, huddled near the still smoking remains of the structure. Her eyebrows were gone, her fingers black at the tips, but she lived. Clara knelt, checked her pulse, then gave her half a flask of warm broth. "Thought I'd see a ghost before I saw you," Mags said, voice crackling like ash. Clara nodded. "You might still." The schoolhouse had collapsed. The church, its steeple snapped in half, stood like a broken tooth on the rise. There were no horses, no dogs barking, no wagons creaking, only Clara, Wren, and the dead, and still she kept walking. It wasn't survival, not really. It was accounting. She checked each house, marked each body with a stick, dug out the ones she could. When night fell, she returned to her cabin and stoked the stove. She laid Wren down beside the firebox, warm and safe, and then she wrote. Her fingers trembled from the cold, but she wrote anyway. A list, names, houses, causes, when she could guess. And then a line beneath it all. The storm proved nothing except the difference between tall and strong. She folded the paper, sealed it in a tin box, and buried it in the wall. The next day, the storm returned. Not as fierce, not as wide, but enough to keep the rest of the world away. Clara didn't mind. She had heat, she had food, she had her daughter, and she had silence. 3 days later, help came from the east. A wagon, 2 men, a sled. When they saw what had happened, they turned pale. They offered to bring Clara back with them, said they'd write to the territorial office, that the whole valley needed surveying, that her cabin was miraculous. She didn't answer, just shook her head. When they left, she went back inside, sealed the door, checked the stove, checked her daughter's breathing, and when she slept, she dreamed of dirt walls and wind that passed her by. Clara didn't count the days after that. The cold measured time in other ways. The sun rose, but not warm. It scraped across the ridgelines like a cold coin, casting sharp shadows over the white wasteland. What trees had remained standing now bowed under the weight of weeks of snow, trunks split like firewood under too much strain. Birds were gone. The sky was dry and clean and unfeeling. Mero's End had become a cemetery without headstones, and Clara, by virtue of her shelter, was the caretaker. She kept to a routine. Every morning she'd heat water with pine pitch and slivers of wild onion, feeding it to Wren with a carved spoon. The child was quiet but alert, her tiny fists clenched in sleep, her body pressed to her mother's chest in a sling that Clara wore day and night. Wren's cries came rarely, only when the fire grew low or her belly empty. Otherwise, she slept, growing, breathing, living. Clara kept a tight watch on their supplies. She rationed beans and hardtack, rotating food from the buried crate she'd packed in October. She melted snow through a stone funnel system she'd built into the cabin wall. Runoff dripped into a sealed clay pot and filtered through sand, warmed slowly by the ambient stove heat. She'd built that system in September, when men mocked her for fancy notions. But she'd known this wasn't just about snow or cold. It was about endurance, not braving the storm, but withstanding it. And now, with the town buried and only the occasional buzzard circling overhead to remind her of death, Clara was the only one walking. She no longer searched for the living. That was over. Now she searched for the lost. She fashioned snowshoes from bent willow and harnessed Whisper, the mule who'd survived, not out of strength, but sheer disinterest in dying. Together they made rounds through the valley, checking collapsed cabins, retrieving tools, salvaging nails from broken rafters. She found the Beckett boy frozen stiff in his attic, hands wrapped around his little sister's shoulders. The roof had torn off the house and they'd tried to climb higher, as if height would bring warmth. She carried their bodies one at a time and laid them side by side in the church cellar. She found a young wife, Annie Lead, huddled beside her husband in the barn, both still in their nightclothes. The goats had chewed half the hem off Annie's gown. She buried them beneath hay and laid her last candle on the beam above them. Some she couldn't reach, others were too far gone to move, but Clara wrote them all down in her ledger, a thick, soot-dark book salvaged from the schoolhouse, its pages brittle from the cold but still usable. She used charcoal from her stove. She wrote clearly, carefully. James Carver died outside, attempting to cross the creek, coat torn, no gloves. Dottie Sells, infant girl, frozen in crib, cabin collapsed. Tom and Eli Carpenter, found together, still tied, still holding hands. There was no sentiment in the notes, just fact. Clara believed in fact. Emotion, she'd learned long ago, had its uses, but in survival, it was a luxury. And still the cold did not break. Weeks passed. She stopped hearing from the road. No more wagons came, no word from the east. The men who'd promised a return never did. Spring should have come. It didn't. One morning, Clara stepped out and found the snow glowing pink under the early light, as if the earth was bleeding underneath. It startled her, until she realized it was skyfire. A red sunrise over a frozen world. The air was so still she could hear ice cracking in distant trees. It sounded like gunshots. She went back inside, rested her hand on Wren's chest, and stared at the wall. Then she decided it was time. Time to do more than survive. Time to rebuild. She started with the church. Its roof was caved, steeple gone, pews shattered by the cold. But the bones were there. The stone foundation, the back room with the old iron stove, the cellar stairs that hadn't splintered under the freeze. It took her 3 days to dig a path wide enough for Whisper to pull a sled. She moved what lumber she could, salvaged nails, removed broken window panes and replaced them with hide. She used scraps of waxed cloth to create door flaps, hauled stones to fill gaps in the broken floor. Then she lit the stove. The first time smoke curled from that chimney again. It rose straight into the air. No wind, no pressure, a sign, maybe, or just the weather. But Clara felt something shift in her chest. That night, she brought Wren there, let her sleep in the quiet room behind the altar while she worked. She wrote new names in the ledger. Repaired pews, 2. Stove working. Door reinforced. The next morning she started on the Harper barn. Mags had died 2 nights before, quietly, wrapped in every blanket she owned, fingers black, eyes open. Clara found her in the stall, beside the goat she'd loved more than any man. She laid her on a sled and pulled her to the church. Buried her behind it, beneath stones and a broken plank that once bore hymn numbers. Then she took Mags's tools, a spade, a saw, a crate of nails saved for someday. Someday had come. By the 3rd week of April, Clara had cleared 4 cabins and converted the root cellars into stores. She laid dried strips of meat on the rafters, built hooks for lanterns, packed the walls with hay. She used rope to mark paths between structures, so that even in the worst snow she could find her way. There were no more voices, no children's laughter, no sound of saws or horses, only Clara and the wind. She became something else during that time. Not just a woman, not just a survivor. Something older, something hard and hollowed, like the bones of the earth she'd built into. Her fingers were calloused like bark, her face wind-burned and expressionless. The towns that existed before the freeze would never return, not like they were, but something would, and Clara would be the one to build it. One morning in May, or what she guessed to be May, she heard a sound, not the wind, not cracking trees, a voice, high, fragile, a child. Clara froze, set down the beam she'd been hauling. Whisper flicked his ears and brayed once. The voice came again, faint but real. She followed it across the ridge toward the remnants of the Finch cabin, a small house that had been swallowed entirely by a slide early in the storm. No one had ever found them. Clara dug. Hours passed. Her fingers bled. She pulled at ice, at rock, at planks twisted like matchsticks. The voice came and went. She found him just past sundown. A boy, maybe 5, curled in a wooden box like a crate of apples, covered in wool and hay. His eyes were dull with dehydration, but he blinked. He moved. She said nothing, just lifted him, wrapped him in her coat, and carried him back. He slept in the church, beside Wren. Clara sat all night watching them both. The boy's name was Lewis. He was not the last. In the days that followed, 2 more emerged. A young girl, Esther, who'd hidden in a chimney flue, and an old man, Art Weller, who'd survived by sealing himself in his tool shed with cans of lard and pickled beans. They came crawling from the white like ghosts, returning to flesh. Gaunt, filthy, alive, Clara brought them all to the church. She didn't say much, didn't comfort. She built bunks, stoves, sleds, shelves. They began to help. Esther could hold a nail. Louis could carry scraps. Art could mend leather with trembling hands. And slowly the town began to hum again. Not loud, not bright, but alive. One day Clara returned from a salvage run to find Esther singing. It was tuneless, soft, nonsense words, but it was song. Clara stood in the doorway and wept, just once. Then she went back to work. The cabin on the hillside still stood. It hadn't shifted, hadn't sagged, not a beam was loose. The stove still burned evenly, its pipe warm through the stone. Clara returned to it often. She kept it for herself and Wren, a sanctuary, a reminder. The others, what few had survived, were housed in the buildings she'd rebuilt, and when the snow finally broke for good and green shoots peeked through the slush, they gathered outside the church. Louis took her hand. "You saved us," he whispered. Clara looked down the hill at the open valley, now scattered with stone markers and boarded cabins. "No," she said, "I outlasted it." By the time summer showed itself, it did so shyly, in sudden gusts of soft wind, in the glint of water unfrozen, and in the earth's slow cracking as buried things remembered the sun. But Mero's end was not the same valley it had been before the storm. It was quieter, smaller, heavier. There were only 7 people left. Clara counted them. Her daughter Wren, Louis, the boy she had found beneath the Finch cabin, Esther, pale and spindle-limbed, who never let go of Clara's sleeve, Art Weller, the old carpenter with one good eye and one slow hand, a woman named Fran who had come down from the North Trail with frostbitten toes and 2 dead mules, and a man named Jeb Carter, who'd been assumed lost weeks earlier, a trapper who lived deep in the woods and returned only when he was sure the snow wouldn't follow. And then there was Clara, the one whose cabin had not fallen, whose stove had not died, whose walls had not broken. They didn't call her foolish anymore. They called her the spine of the town. She didn't like that. She didn't want a title. But when she gave an order, it was followed. When she pointed at a half-rotted beam and said it could be used, it was cut. When she rationed the last jar of beans between 3 children, no one argued. The thaw brought back sound, birdsong, trickling creeks, the sigh of wet branches as they dropped their snow burdens. But it also brought reminders of everything that had died. They buried 17 people before June. They stopped counting after that. Clara kept her ledger, quietly, each name marked in soot and water-smudged ink. She drew lines between them, grouped families together, added notes about where they were found, what they left behind. Sometimes she wrote things she didn't read aloud. Rachel Benning, found curled around doll made of rags, no firewood left in house. Harlan Mott, door barricaded, gun empty, wound self-inflicted. Thompset baby, only child found warm, wrapped in every blanket, likely died last. There was no one to read the book but her. But that was enough. It was Clara who redug the well, Clara who taught Louis and Esther to plant, Clara who took Jeb's traps and reset them in the creek beds, showing how to gut and hang a squirrel without wasting a drop. She never wasted anything. Every scrap of cloth, every broken hinge, every bent nail, repurposed. Even grief. When Fran collapsed one morning while carrying kindling, Clara wrapped her body in the same quilt Mags had died beneath and buried her beside the church without a word. She patted the ground flat with her shovel. Wren was strapped to her chest the entire time, softly cooing. No one asked questions, not anymore. That summer was dry enough the river ran shallow and the grass never fully greened. But they made it through. Clara had built a smoking shed for the fish Jeb caught. They dried mushrooms and gathered wild nettles. Art taught Louis how to split wood, though the boy's arms shook with every swing. Esther learned to stir the stew without spilling. Wren took her first steps in the church hallway, clutching the edge of a pew. And through it all, Clara built a second shelter behind the schoolhouse, a storehouse dug beneath her own cabin, a narrow tunnel connecting the church to the root cellar in case another storm ever came. Each project built with the same grit she'd buried herself in that first winter. The knowledge that what you built had to matter. It had to last. It had to hold against the worst. That fall, the settlers came. 3 wagons from down the range, families who'd heard rumors that the storm hadn't taken everyone, that a woman had survived with a child, that there was heat in Mero's End when the rest of the world froze. Clara watched them arrive from the ridge. They looked tired, thin, but alive. They asked questions. Who was left? What remained? Was it safe? Clara didn't lie. She pointed to the cemetery, showed them the scorched frames of cabins, told them what the wind had done. Still, they stayed. The valley had room. And Clara's cabin, still half buried in the hillside, proved a kind of truth few could argue with. By winter, the town had grown to 12. They rebuilt the schoolhouse. Clara taught Lewis to read, taught Esther to write numbers. Jeb and one of the new settlers, a stonemason named Samuel, reinforced the church with timber salvaged from the old saloon. They installed a new bell. It rang only once that winter, when a tree broke through one of the new roofs. No one died. No one froze. They had fuel, food, water. Clara made sure of it. But something else happened that year. Something Clara hadn't prepared for. Hope. It came slow, in smiles that lasted too long, in quiet laughter around the stew pot, in the way the children ran now, not because they were chased, but because they could, in the way Art sat outside some mornings, warming his hands in the low sun, carving pieces of wood into animals. One morning, Lewis brought Clara a carved horse. "It's for Wren," he said, staring at his feet, "so she can ride something before she walks too far." Clara took it, held it, nodded. She didn't cry, not then. She saved that for the night, when Wren curled against her, and the stove crackled, and the walls around them, stone, earth, and fire, felt less like shelter and more like home. That spring, a writer came. From the capital, he said, sent by the rail company, or the governor. Clara didn't listen closely. He wanted to document the miracle, called it a survival of the frontier spirit, said he'd heard of the woman who lived in the hill, called her a heroine. She didn't offer him tea, didn't show him Wren. When he asked if he could see her cabin, she shrugged and led him there. He stood in the doorway, scribbling in his leather notebook, talking to himself. Astonishing. Buried cabin. Unorthodox design. Ingenious vent system. You engineered this? I built it, Clara said. He glanced at her. But the concept, where did it come from? Clara looked at the stone, the packed walls, the stove still burning softly. Storms don't fight fair, she said, so I didn't build fair. He blinked, then smiled like a man who thought he understood something he didn't. Clara showed him out. He stayed one more night, then left. Promised to send a copy of the article. She never received it. She didn't care. The years passed, slow, gentle, harsh in ways, but survivable. Children grew, graves were tended, fields were planted. Clara's hillside cabin never fell. They called it the shelter. New families built in the open again. Some even put porches on their houses. But a few, especially those who'd heard the old stories, chose the slopes, built half-buried, built thick, built smart. And whenever a child asked why there were two doors in Clara's house, one to the outside, one to the stone-lined tunnel behind, she'd kneel and point to the earth. "This hill," she'd say, "breathed for us when nothing else would. We stay close to it, and it stays close to us." Wren grew tall, strong, quiet like her mother, but with a fire in her step that came from knowing the world had tried to take her before she could walk. She never feared the cold. She slept near the stove, tended it when Clara's hands began to tremble, ran the tunnel path twice a day, just to keep the muscles in her legs lean and ready. Clara watched, and when her back bent, and her pace slowed, she taught Wren how to read the ledger, how to build a brace beam, how to test if a wall would hold. "You build like the storm is coming," she said, "because it always is." When Clara finally passed, it was not in snow or darkness. It was spring. The hillside was green. She died in her sleep, Wren's hand wrapped in hers. They buried her in the slope, just above the cabin, with a stone marker carved by Art, who'd outlived all odds and died just 2 weeks later. The stone read, "Clara Dawn, who built into the hill when everyone else built up and outlasted the wind." Wren stood on the ridge where her mother had once watched the wagons roll in. The valley of Mero's End stretched beneath her, a narrow cradle of scattered homes, each chimney smoking gently in the early cold. No blizzards now, no biting wind, just a soft, early frost curling along the fence posts and the eaves of the rebuilt schoolhouse. Behind her, the hillside cabins still breathed. She could hear the low hum of the stove within, the way it had for decades. Even now, with her mother gone, Wren lit it each night with the same discipline Clara had taught her. Dry kindling first, a coal brick after, the vent cleared, the door latched tight. The room would warm evenly, silently, and slowly, just like Clara had wanted. No flash, no smoke, no waste. The town no longer feared the cold the way it once had, but they remembered. They remembered the winter that killed nearly everyone, the storm no one else survived, and the woman who survived it not by luck, not by stubbornness, but by knowing what would come. That was the difference. Clara hadn't hoped for safety. She had built it. She hadn't waited for rescue. She had dug. And now, 2 decades later, the shape of her cabin had become the shape of the town. Not every home was buried, not every roof was sod-packed and stone-weighted, but every structure bore her mark in some way. Thicker walls, cellar vents, wind-facing entries, low profiles that hugged the land instead of fighting it. She'd changed the way the town saw its place in the wild, changed what survival meant. Wren stepped down from the ridge, her boots breaking the frost with careful crunches. She passed the small stone markers along the slope, her mother's first, then Art's, then a row of smooth river rocks marking the graves of others who had come after. Jeb Carter, who'd taught Wren to trap with her bare hands. Lewis, who'd died in a fall near the river when he was just 20, and Esther, who had gone east to marry but returned to die beside the same church she'd sung in as a girl. Each stone had no more than 3 lines. That was tradition now, Clara's tradition. A name, a truth, and a line of wisdom, if any could be found. Wren entered the church. It smelled like dry wood and old heat. The pews were smoothed by generations of hands. The ceiling had been reinforced with hand-forged brackets Samuel's son had made before leaving for the cities. On the altar lay Clara's ledger, not behind glass, not sealed, just lying there, waiting. Wren opened it. The first half had been her mother's. Careful charcoal, names written in perfect small block letters, details added with precision. Died during first storm, 1871, built tall. No cellar. The second half was Wren's own. She'd continued the record not out of duty, but because Clara had made her understand that memory, true memory, unflinching and unsentimental, was survival. Without it, people built the wrong way, thought the storm was over. But the storm was never over. It just took new forms. Wren added a new entry. Samuel Greer died of fever, refused to leave barn, tried to wait it out. His wife found him clutching blueprints. She paused, then wrote a line beneath it. Even hope needs walls. That night she returned to the hillside cabin. It was quiet. The stone chimney puffed gently. The vents were clean. The tunnel to the church, now widened and lined with timber, remained bone-dry even after the summer rain. She laid a hand on the central beam, still solid. Her mother had laid that one herself. Wren had been a toddler, watching her from the straw pile, mouthing every motion of the hammer. She ran her fingers along the packed earthen wall, smooth, dry, warm. Clara had taught her something few others understood. A house doesn't resist the world. It accepts it. It moves with it. It learns the shape of the hill, the breath of the ground, the pattern of the thaw and freeze. The men who'd once called her mother foolish had died because they believed survival meant conquering the cold. Clara had known better. You don't conquer the storm, you outlast it. You disappear into the hill and you wait it out. The next morning, Wren walked the town. A girl followed her, barely 10, with a braid down her back and freckles across her nose. Her name was Leah, the granddaughter of one of the newer settlers. "Miss Wren," Leah said, jogging to catch up. "They're starting the school repairs today." Wren nodded. "You helping?" "Papa said I could hold the nails if I don't talk too much." Wren gave her a small smile. "Fair trade." They passed the well, now lined in stone with a rope pulley and reinforced lid, past the blacksmith's shop. Not active yet, but with a forge hearth newly built. The town had grown to 31 souls, a mix of settlers, traders, quiet types who'd heard there was something here more stable than luck. Wren reached the foundation of the old saloon. Only the front beam remained, twisted and blackened, but she stood there a moment, hand resting on it. "Was this the place?" Leah asked. Wren didn't answer. She didn't have to. They kept walking. Wren led her up the slope, past the newer cabins, one made entirely of sod bricks, another sunken with only the roof visible from above. She pointed to the hill. Leah squinted. "Is that yours?" "No," Wren said. "That's my mother's." "But you live there?" "I keep it," Wren corrected. "Living in it would be easy. Keeping it, that's harder." Leah tilted her head. "Why is it so low?" "So the wind can't grab it." "Why is the window so small?" "So it never shatters." The girl chewed her lip. "People still think it's weird." Wren gave her a long look. "And who survived?" Leah flushed. "You did." "She did." Wren knelt, pulled a handful of earth from beside the path, held it up to the girl. "This," she said, "is smarter than most men. It shifts when the wind shifts, holds tight when it has to. When you build with it, you're not fighting, you're joining." The girl frowned. "Joining what?" "Whatever comes next." Wren let the dirt fall. The wind caught it, carried it. A crow called in the distance. She stood. That winter, a heavy snow came early. The sky turned a deep, bruised gray, and the cold rolled in like a memory of the old storm. Some of the newcomers panicked, asked if they should leave or ride south. Wren said no. She checked the stores, counted the cords of wood, measured the grain, walked the tunnel twice, reinforced the church stove with a second vent pipe. That night it snowed. For 2 days, wind battered the town, but the cabins didn't creak, the walls didn't split, no doors blew open, no babies cried in hunger. They waited it out. And when the snow passed, Wren stood on the ridge again, looking down. Smoke rose from every chimney, warm, steady, defiant. She smiled. Her mother had been right. You don't build to impress men. You don't build for what has been. You build for what might come. The hillside cabin stayed warm, and the valley endured.